Hi.
Did Tammy give you the message about what God?
Insect-free food. We're on page 266. We started the subject matter, I think, a couple weeks ago and last week. We talked about the requirement to check food. So today we're going to discuss which foods have to be checked. There are three general categories of food with respect to the prohibition of consuming insects. So there are foods that are considered nagua. Nagua means they are presumed to be infested. Number two, there's something called miut hamatsui. It's a statistical minority, but it's not irrelevant. It's an important minority. That's called miut hamatsui. Those that contain insects in what they call a significant minority of cases. And then there are foods that are considered naki, those that are presumed to be completely clean of insects, unless you see an insect. So these are the three categories that we're going to deal with in terms of the chiyuv of checking. So the halacha concerning those foods that are nagua means foods that have a chazaka that they're infested is brought by the Shulchan Aruch in your same siman pei dalid. Komine peros shedarkan latliek shem chubarim, all kinds of fruits that are likely to have worms in them when they're connected to the ground. So lo yochalat sheivda kapri mitocho, they have to be checked on the inside. Shema yesh bo tola, they might have a worm. Based on this halacha, one is obligated to check any food that is known to generally contain insects. This measurement applies to any foods that contain insects more than 50% of the time. That's brought by the Sefer B'dikas HaMozon K'Halacha by Rav Moshe Vayar, who is considered one of the world's experts on insects and the halachas related to them. Ma'acholim shedarkan latliya, foods that have a general tendency of getting worms in them. Asur la'ochlam mibli lebodkam. You can't eat them unless you check them. Shema yesh b'hem tolaim. And then machalim shedarkam latliya kavanahi. What does that mean? What kind of foods? Machalim sheberov hapamim. Rov means of anything above 50%. Mutsuya b'hem negiot. V'agdartam muchzak kinagua. If they statistically more than 50% of the fruits, if you check them, have insects, they're considered that they have a chazaka that they're nagua. And the muchzak kinagua, and if you have a fruit that the chazaka is that they are infested, habediki midoraisa. So the inspection is a requirement midoraisa. Mishum davi safik doraisa. To eat the beria is doraisa. In fact, you get 4 or 5 or 6 malkios, depending on whether they're insects on the land or insects in the air or insects in the water. So we're certainly dealing not with a rabbinic prohibition, but a doraisic prohibition. So me'achar yesh rov or mechzal sheyesh tolaim, and that's how it's brought by the shach. We'll see it soon, that shach. What is the halacha if one did not check for insects in these cases? So you have a chiyuv to check, you didn't check. So the Sefer Kashrus rules that it's forbidden to eat the food. For example, tavshil or mafeh, you have a certain dish or a baked good. Shu chanui machal shalom nivdak. So let's say you used a fruit that the halach is you have to check it, and you didn't check it. Chova atagam ken livdok et hasheirit sheba arizot. So first of all, let's say you have a remnant of the package still from the food that you hadn't checked. You have a chiyuv to check whatever is remaining in the package. You have to check the food or the baked good that you prepared to make sure that there's no insect there. If there's ein efsharut labod kam, if you can't check it properly, if they can't be checked, you can't eat the food. This comes from the shach, who notes that one may not be lenient even b'diavad, if it is known that this food that was prepared that it's considered infested. V'hainu shelo hulsaku perush b'stat. Aval pratiim b'medina shehulsuk b'kach havi v'adai v'lo safek. If you live in a certain area and it's considered in that area that this type of food is infested with insects, so that's not a case of safek, it's a case of certainty. And therefore you're not allowed to eat the food if it wasn't checked. So this is the halacha regarding foods, and we're going to see which ones are which soon. Anything that's considered nagua, infested, we're very machmir, that you've got to check it before you eat it. You didn't check it, you can't eat the food. Then, the second category of miyut hamotsui includes foods that sometimes are found to contain bugs. So it's not 50%, but sometimes they're found to have it. These types of foods are also obligated to be checked, as noted by the Ramah in his comments to the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch that we quoted, and the B'dikas Hamozon Kalacha, where he continues. Says the Ramah, "V'lo ma'ani b'hem im bada karov." You can't even inspect, say, the majority of these fruits. You got to check each and every one. So we have learned previously that according to some poskim, this category of miyut hamotsui only includes foods for which the chance of infestation are close to 50%. While other poskim maintain that even if there's a 5 to 10% chance of infestation, it is still included. So this is the approach that is actually more widely followed, and such foods have to be checked. The Yalkut Yosef appears to give equal weight to the more lenient approach, according to which many foods that are discussed later in the shir as qualifying as miyut hamotsui would not need to be checked. So Sfardim who follow the Yalkut Yosef might have a reason to be more lenient. So what is the halacha if foods in this category were not checked properly for bugs? Sefer Kashrus rules that in such cases, such as with regard to baked goods containing flour grown in Israel, flour in Israel is considered by many to be in the category of miyut hamotsui with regard to the frequency of insects found inside. So that's not in America. So it is possible, though, that one may be lenient b'diavad based on a ruling of the Rashba. It means the halach is you have to check the flour. If you didn't check it, you baked it. There's a leniency of the Rashba. Botzek shehulchan, you have dough that was prepared. Olechem shenafa, you have bread that was baked. Nikemach shelo over nifui. The flour didn't go through a sieve, and it wasn't checked. So first of all, in no time auto kemach boter and sanisha. If you have any flour left, you got a chiyuv to check it. Im nishar noki, if it's clean of insects, mutar b'achila. But nimsa bo afilu tola achas, even if there's only one worm, so yesh osrim osam b'achila means if you check the flour after you had prepared the bread, the remaining flour in the bag, and you found no insects, according to this Rashba, you'd be allowed to eat the bread. But if you found even one insect in the remaining flour, it would be also to eat the bread. Now, what if there's no flour left over? Lo notar klal kemach, habotzek ba'mafeh mutorim. So the leniency, the Rashba says, you can rely on the fact that it's a meal. Al pichuvas Rashba, heyos v'kemach ena muchzik lios mitalua. It's not completely muchzik. It's not greater than 50%. Vein zel miyut hamotsui. It's a minority. Sheyesh bo tulayim. Therefore, the Rashba is mattering because of a double suffix. Number one, suffix hayarachash. First of all, we're not even sure that they were there, and maybe suffix nimuach is batel, and maybe in the cooking process it got dissolved. Remember, it's only a problem if it's a baria, if it's a complete insect, because then afilu be'elef lo batel. But since it's only a suffix that it's there, we have two sfeikos. Maybe it's not there. And suffix number two, maybe it's not a whole. You don't have a
You
double
always have
suffix.
space maker.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If it's murzak, you wouldn't have a sfeik sveka. It means if it was 50%,
Right.
so since here it's not murzak, that gives you the first suffix that maybe it's not there. I.e., if it was greater than 50%, that you don't have the first suffix, that maybe it's not there. You have to assume that it's there. Then you only have one suffix. And with one suffix, you wouldn't be able to be matur. Thus, according to this ruling, the foods made from this flour are permitted since insects are only present in a minority of cases. But the flour is not considered nagua, in which case we may rely on the double uncertainty that perhaps they're not present. And even if they are, perhaps they were dissolved in the cooking process in our bottle. Since they're no longer whole, we learned that previously. Then there's a category called misase, which refers to someone who did not intend to perform the action at all. You have no kavanah to eat the insect. It's a dover shein miskavin. Those learning the daf yomi now, we understand that concept. You have a malacha, but you don't intend that malacha. You have no kavanah at all for that malacha. So Reb Shimon, we paskin like Reb Shimon, the dover shein miskavin is mutter. So here as well, Rav Moshe Sternbuch, the Tzurba M'Rabanan, tell us that you would be exempt from liability in a case where because you'd probably be in a category of misasek, like this. This issue regarding the concern that there might be a worm in a bread. When you're eating bread, your kavanah is to eat bread, not shrotzim. You're considered someone who's just sort of playing with this isser. You have no kavanah to eat the sheretz. Now, if chaylev, prohibited fats, are in a mixture, or regarding a prohibited sexual relation, and it's a suffix, so in those cases, in P'tur Misasek, there we don't have this heter of a dover shein miskavin, because shekein nen, you cannot but get hana from those actions of eating chaylev, because chaylev gives good taste, and in any kind of sexual relation. So there is no p'tur of a misasek if you're nen. Hainu dafka b'chila shenenem imene kamo chaylev. Ava b'shrotzim lo shayich nen. Nobody enjoys eating an insect. Shenafsho shel adam kotza behen. Most human beings are disgusted by eating shrotzim. V'mocha v'lo yoda nikra misasek. Therefore, let's say you happen to eat an insect and you didn't know you're a misasek regarding the isser shrotzim. V'nisr klau shetamim nizbatel b'kemach. Below neragish klau, their taste, number one, is nullified in dough and wasn't detected. So you're not over it according to the way the Tzurba M'Rabanan learns. Okay, so we dealt so far with foods that are nagua, completely infested, where we were very machmir. You can't eat it without checking, and even after you cook it, you can't eat it if you can't check it. Now we dealt with the miuda matsui, primarily the issue of flour in Eretz Yisrael, where we said you have the Rashba and the Tzurba M'Rabanan, it seems to be a little leniency regarding that. Still, l'chatchila, they have to check it. If they didn't check it, it was baked. There are reasons to be matir. Now, the third category is foods that are considered to be naki. Those fruits and vegetables and other foods that are presumed to be clean of insects. These foods do not need to be inspected carefully prior to eating. What is the halacha, though, if one discovers insects in one of these types of food? Can you eat the rest of the food? So the Shulchan Aruch rules that it depends on how many insects were discovered. If there were 3 or more found, then the food is infested and is forbidden. If less than that were found, then you just remove the insects and the food is permitted. Yesh misha omer, dahani mili shelo nimtzu alei echad or shnayim. That is permitted if you only find 1 or 2. Aval shlosha udal hakol asur. Says the Ramah, v'davka meichel, the yafshel l'sanino. Talking about a food that you can't strain or put through a sieve. L'hasir mematolaim. So we're talking about a food that you can't check, and now you found 3 or 4, so it's considered infested. So the whole thing is usher. No. But the Ramah says that if you can filter it, so if it's possible to filter it, you can filter it. So page 270, which foods must be checked? So which foods fall into which category and which are presumed to be clear? Although as mentioned, some foods are more likely to contain insects than others, we should note that ideally, one should at least glance at any food that you're about to eat, even ones that are generally bug-free, to ensure that there are no bugs that happen to have made their way inside. This is especially true when you're eating outside, such as in the sukkah, in the park, at the beach. So aside from that, the Sefer HaKashrus offers the following list of items that are considered to likely contain insects and must be checked. It should be noted that some would be considered nagua. He says broccoli and lettuce, while others would only qualify for the category of niotamotsu, lentils and beans. It should also be noted that a number of these, such as beans, rice, and corn on the cob, only need to be checked in Israel, but not in other countries. The footnote says, for a list of foods detailing the level of insect infestation in various countries around the world, there's a chart in that Sefer of Moshe Vaya, and that Israel has a higher frequency of bug infestation than other countries, with large population of Jews for many kinds of food. So the Sefer HaKashrus says, Elohem Shadarka Matliya, asparagus, artichoke, botzel yarok, green onions, scallions, broccoli, chasa, which is romaine lettuce, kosbara, which is coriander, kruv, cabbage, kruvit is cauliflower, salak alim, which is beets, petrozelia, which is parsley, shamir, which is dill, tiros kalachim, which is corn on the cob, tered, which is spinach, guava, charuvim, carrots, te'enim, and triim vivishim, dried and fresh figs, tutsadeh, strawberries, adashim chomim, brown lentils, polim, beans, v'orez besakim, rice that you buy in sacks. Yesh l'tzayin, shebeshitot hagidul ha'organic, im tzuyotim shotolei mecharkim shchicha yoter. But when you buy organic produced food, there's a bigger chance that foods would be infested, even outside of Israel. The other type of food that can occasionally contain tiny insects is flour. The Rosh notes that it's possible bugs found in flour may have hatched after the wheat from which the flour was produced was picked. If so, they would not be forbidden, since they never left the flour. Remember, we learned that if the worm is connected to the tree, then it remains usher. But if it got infested afterwards and never emerged from the fruit, we said it was not usher. So they're assuming that the insects might have grown in the flour itself, never left the flour, so those would not be prohibited. He goes, this is not definitely the case, and therefore they would still be forbidden. Says the Rosh, small insects that you find in flour and in salt, shekorin milvin, lama lo yu asurin. Why should they not be asur? You always have to be worried that maybe they did leave the flour or the salt, creeped a little bit on the ground and went back in, and that would certainly make it a sheretz ala aretz, and therefore the Rosh is machmir. It's a very nice biography of the Rosh. Susie and I visited Toledo a couple years ago in Spain, where the Rosh was the Mord Asra. The Rosh was actually the student of the Marami Rottenberg in Worms. And after the Marami Rottenberg was taken captive and held for ransom, the Rosh escaped to Spain. It became pretty much the Gadol Hador in Spain. So the Rosh was sort of a transitional figure between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. And that's one of the reasons why the Shulchan Aruch relies on the Rosh as one of the three Poskei Halacha, the Rif, the Rosh, and the Rambam, when he decides what the Psak Halacha is. So the Shulchan Aruch says, Tola'im and Tzimba worms that were found in flour, maybe they left the flour, arts, and they crept on the ground and came back. Says the Ramav, Wadin ben Melach, same thing with salt, or Shardvim Sheno Mashke, or other things are not liquid. I know my wife Susie keeps 5-pound bags of sugar in the freezer for that reason. I think it has to do with not, flour is mentioned here, flour and salt, but sugar is also one of those kind of products that could be infested. The Shach notes, though, that the flour may still be used even after discovering insects if it can be sifted in a manner that removes them. That means you might have a sieve that's not small enough that won't remove the insects. If they're big enough, you can put them through a sieve, or shardvam vada, but it certainly would be permitted if you can get rid of the insects. Now, must one check flour for insects before using it? Based on what we have learned, the answer should be that it depends on whether insects are occasionally found within the flour or not. In the United States, many other countries, insects are not commonly found in standard flour, unless it's stored for an exceptionally long period of time, such as a few months. And it therefore does not need to be checked or sifted on a regular basis before you use it. However, the flour in Israel and other countries such as Russia and Brazil, they sometimes contain small insects that are visible to the eye, and they're classified in a category of neotamotsui, as we learned. Therefore, many poskim assume that the flour in Israel should be sifted with special sifters. There are many types of fruit and vegetables that are assumed to be bug-free, unless insects are discovered, and these are the following that are considered bug-free. Elo aminim amuzokim kinekiim, avatiach, watermelon, other kinds of melon, bananot, avocado, malafafon, cucumbers, kishuin, zucchini, kohlrabi, kukus, which is coconuts, kufkar bekufsaot pach, oats, avkat afia, baking powder, cafe, sukar, melach v'kinamon, and cinema. If you know that there are insects, then you got to check them. If in general, though, these are consumed to be clean and don't have to be checked before use.
Question, Ernie.
Yes.
I think there's a little section there, but why do they not provide practical ways to inspect? You know, when you see people talking about inspecting you hear, I call it horror stories of people like under a microscope inspecting every little, vegetable component. I mean, it'd take you hours to prepare anything.
Well, we're gonna tonight on page 276. We're gonna go through this actually as a group. These are guidelines in checking produce for insects. So I think it'll answer some of the practical questions you want to know about, because I think that's important. We've learned the halachot that govern this, whether the miyud hamatzui concept and the nagua concept, and then I think we will get more practical before we finish tonight's shiur. Now, fish can also contain insects. One may not have expected fish to be subject to this problem, but over the past decade, a major halachic controversy has developed with regarding to this issue. It was recently discovered that some types of fish contain worms called anisakis inside. Although a detailed description of the facts is beyond the scope of the shiur, halachic authorities have disputed the status of such worms, often found in fish that live in certain parts of the world. There is a statement in the Gemara in Chulin that insects found inside the flesh of fish are permissible. Amrav Sheshas, Greater Avidi, Kukiani Asiri. These are worms found in the internal organs. My time, also because they crept in from the outside world, so they were already shrotzim involved in the prohibition. Maski Ravashi, Imam Asu, Lishtachu Derech Beisarei. Then how come they haven't come out?
They started from inside. The Gemara is saying they originated from inside the animal.
No. My time, and they alma asu. Alma means from outside the world. And that's why the kukiani are asur, because rather than have started, remember, because if a worm somehow did not come from the outside world, it might be a reason to be matir. If it originated within the body itself, like we learned, it's got to either creep on the ground, fly in the water.
That's the second version. Okay, I see it.
So the first lashon
The
is
second lashon I'm looking at,
the
right?
second. So let's go. So Maskil Ravashi Ima Ama Asu, if they came. So the Gemara, when it says Kukyani Osiri, they are found in the internal organ. They weren't found in the digestive tract. They're found in the spleen, in the liver, in the heart, in some other organ, not necessarily in the flesh. So Ravashi says, if they came from the outside, what are they doing there? You should find them in the digestive tract, because that's how the animal, but that's how the person took it in. You know, let's say we're talking about a beef animal. Now, Ikidi Amri, Amr of Shishabray Ravidi, Kokyani Sharu. Worms found inside are permitted. Why? Mine Gavli, because they grew inside the animal. They didn't come from the outside. Amr Vashi Pshita. I agree. We would have found it in the digestive. So that's the Gemara's diyun back and forth. Hilchasa. What is the halacha? Kukyani asiri. They're forbidden. My timer. Minam nayim. The animal is asleep. Va'anile be'usye. And it enters the animal through its nose. Or this is talking about fish. Even in a fish. And tolaim darni de basra. And then they travel to the internal organs without going through the digestive tract. So therefore, if they're found there, they're asiri. But the kavri, but if they're found between the skin and the flesh, shari, it's permitted. So according to Rashi, the insects under discussion, the first case of Kukyani, are found within animals. But Tosfos, Sadi Rabbeinu Tam, holds they're found inside fish. So there's a debate, what are these Kukyani? So Rashi says they're in animals, but Tosfos says no, they're in fish. Ela Amar Rabbeinu Tam the begodim ivy, the bedogim ivy. These are this case talking about fish. According to Tosfos, what is the difference between the first case of the Gemara, where it says that the worms were forbidden, and the second where they are permitted? The Beis Yosef suggests that in the first case, the worms enter from the outside through the intestines and then enter the stomach and are therefore forbidden. However, in the second case, the worms are born and grow within the flesh. Therefore, they are subject to the rule that insects that never emerge from their original habitat are permitted. And the Shulchan Aruch rules according like Beis Yosef. Well, he is the Beis Yosef. But in Tzoim Bedogim B'Meyeyem Asuri. So if you find worms in the intestines of a fish, those are asur. But if you find the worms being or labasur, between the flesh and between the skin and the flesh, all betoch habasur, or within the flesh, mutarin. Based according to these makoros, worms found within the skin of a fish should be permitted, since they grew there and did not enter from the outside. This is in contrast to worms found in the intestines, which we have to assume entered from the outside, which would be prohibited because they came from either the ground or the water, and they're prohibited as a sheretz. The problem is that in this case, the scientific research shows that these anisaki worms actually originate from outside the fish and then enter the intestines and then the stomach. And after the fish is dead, they burrow from the stomach through the flesh of the fish. If so, perhaps they should have the status of forbidden insects, despite the Gemara's lenient ruling. Since they clearly, now science tells us, they clearly originate from outside the fish and enter the flesh from the stomach. This discrepancy between the ruling of the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch and the current scientific facts has created a major halachic controversy among contemporary poskim. Some poskim rule that these insects and the fish that they are found in are forbidden, as logic dictates that if it's clear that the worms have entered from outside, they should be forbidden. That was the position taken by the Shevet HaLevi, Harav Vosner, just passed away a few years ago in Bnei Brak, in a similar issue concerning whitefish years earlier, where he argues that Chazal only referred to a specific type of worm, but not necessarily to these cases. Chazal made the rule that they permitted it because they understood that that fish and that worm, that worm grew inside the fish. But a regular worm on we can't be mad if we don't know for sure that it grew in the fish. Maybe it grew from the outside. In fact, science is telling them it does grow from the outside. That was Rav Wosner's opinion. This stringent position is taken as well in the case of the Anisakis by poskim such as Rav Shneur Zalman Ravach, Rav Yashiv, and Rav Gershon Bess of Los Angeles.
Nice.
However, Rav Belsky took a more lenient stance. And this lenient opinion is shared by Rav Yechezkel Roth, who is the Dayan in the Satmar Bezdin, and Rav Shlomo Miller of Toronto, who I've met a number of times and have discussed halacha with regarding urology. He's a major posek in Toronto.
By the way, I think Gershon Bess is very close to this Rabbi Roth, this Yechezkel Roth, who he differs with on this.
Right. He differs. However, Rabelsky took a more lenient stance. He argues that once the Gemara and Shulchan Aruch have permitted this case, one need not be stringent. And what's the OU policy on worms and fish? Rabelsky confirmed unequivocally that OU policy remains that there's no checking necessary and no prohibition of the worms found in wild salmon and other fish, in accordance with Yoredea 8416, for the following reason. Shulchan Aruch does not limit the permissibility of tolayim found in the flesh of fish to any species of tolas. The halacha states that a tolas found in the flesh of fish is mutter, because of the rule of mine gavli, which is what we learned today in Chol, that the parasite found in the flesh of the fish is permissible since it grew bigger in the fish. Rav Belki cited Rashi and Gemara as using the term gavul to mean that it became bigger. And he understood this to mean that even if the worm originated and was visible to the naked eye outside of the fish, it would be permitted if it grew in the fish flesh. So what Rav Belsky is saying here, that even if the insect came from the outside, and we normally would prohibit, but if it grew, you get the heter. That's the Gemara's heter of gavul, meaning bigger. Rav Belsky felt there is no reason to believe that the tolaim present today are any different from the tolaim present in Chulin. Rav Belsky felt this reason itself was sufficient to permit the matter. There were other additional reasons to permit. Many other kashrut organizations, in addition to the OU, both in the US as well as in Israel, have adopted the more lenient approach to this issue, though some are more stringent based on the poskim above that we quoted, who hold that the worms are forbidden. It's important to realize that this question affects the kashrus of numerous fish sold on the market across the world. According to those who hold that the anisaki worms are forbidden, one may not consume many types of salmon, flounder, halibut, and mackerel, mainly those caught off the coast of China and North America, without cleaning them first. But it's difficult and tedious to do so. You need a light box, and one must be expert in knowing how to identify them. Thus, the recommendation often given for those who are stringent is to avoid those types of fish that are known to contain the anisakas. And there's more information that you can look below. So let's go through some of the guidelines that the Tzurba gives us for checking. This section is based on guidelines from a Hebrew work entitled Minamuter B'Picha, containing practical guidelines for bug checking in Israel, based on the rulings of Rav Mordechai Eliyahu, found in the Hebrew Tzurba M'Rabanan edition, but it's shortened, adapted, and edited for the English version. The frequency of insects found often differs depending on the country. There are also differing opinions given among contemporary poskim in some cases as to whether checking is even required. It is therefore recommended to consult the guidelines given by one's local kashrus organization, upon which one generally relies, as well to determine the exact details of what must be checked and the method of checking. So there are certain indications of infestation that one can look for in cases of wheat, beans, and powders. Although even in Israel, where insects are common, this does not occur very often. It is possible, especially when purchasing food in locations other than a regular supermarket. Produce that is excessively soft, contains excessive amount of crumbs or powder, or the like, may be an indication of infestation in wheat or barley, beans, and other products. Such cases can be easily identified with a brief inspection of the package before purchase. Now, in the presumption of infestation, in case of fruits or vegetables that we've listed, that are presumed to be infested, that were cooked with other foods without being checked, it is questionable whether one may eat the food, as we discussed earlier. Therefore, with regard to vegetables such as parsley, which are presumed to likely contain insects in most countries, if one already placed it in a soup without inspection, one should check 3 spoonfuls of soup and see that no insects have spread to the soup. And one may then eat the soup without the parsley, as it can be assumed that the insects remained in the parsley and did not spread to the soup. But it's preferable to strain the whole soup. So if you can strain the whole soup, get rid of the parsley, strain the soup. If you can't strain the soup, get rid of the parsley. Don't eat the parsley. Take 3 spoonfuls, and then if you don't see any insects there, it should be okay. In some cases, checking a sample, sometimes called a chazaka check, may be sufficient. In these cases, one may check 3 of the food in question and follow the following guidelines. If 2 are infested, the food is presumed to be infested, and there are likely more insects in other parts of the food as well. Therefore, one must check each individual food one by one. Otherwise, you can't eat the food. Now, if all 3 are clean, let's say you chose 3 pieces, you checked all 3, it can be presumed that the entire sample is insect-free. You can eat the entire sample without any more inspections. It should be noted, though, that the opinions differ concerning when this method may be used. And again, they give you a CYA statement to consult your local kashrut organizations. Now, insects discovered in produce that is generally clean, like we talked about the gnocchi. So in these cases, one follows the guide. If 1 or 2 insects were found, just remove them and continue to rest normally. Based on that Shulchan Aruch, we learned if 3 insects were found, the food is presumed to be infested. Therefore, the entire quantity of food must be carefully inspected before eating. If you can't do so, you can't consume the food. Grains and spices sold in Israel may contain insects in the minority of cases and are often recommended to be checked for insects. This includes rice, barley, beans, oats, and the like. The general method of doing so is to spread the product out on a smooth surface and check if any insects are found in between the individual pieces. Flour should be sifted in a special type of sifter. These inspections are generally not required in the Gola like the US. Regarding fruits and vegetables, what are the signs of infestation? Any fruit or vegetable that shows signs of rotting, or if it's especially soft, or if it has holes in it, need to be inspected carefully. And the peels of melon, watermelon, and the like that grow on the ground occasionally have insects on the peel. Now, one who notices, yes?
So the thing about checking samples, that applies to fruits and vegetables that are on the GUA that are known to be infested.
Yes.
And even the samples, just checking
Yes.
3 samples enough.
That's what they said. They said if 2 are infested, then you have to check everything. If you did this chazaka check, if all 3 are clean, you can be assumed that the entire sample is insect-free. Okay, Chaim?
Yeah, okay.
Now, by fruits and vegetables, if it has the peel, one who notices any should wash them prior to opening to ensure that the insects do not enter the food. Similarly, citrus fruits have aphids on the peel. They look like brown or black dots that are 1 to 2 millimeters long that come off easily. One should make sure they do not enter the fruit when peeling it or cutting it open. Below are some suggested instructions for checking for insects concerning selected fruits and vegetables that are generally assumed to contain insects across the world. Note that this is certainly not an exhaustive list, and many others also contain insects must be checked, including cabbage, cauliflower, raspberries. As mentioned previously, guidelines differ as to the precise method of checking on some of these, and it's recommended to consult the guidelines of your local kashrus organization. So, fresh asparagus. Remove all the triangle parts and the tips and the stems using a vegetable peeler and rinse under strong running water while rubbing with one's hand or a thin nylon brush. If the asparagus is frozen or canned, you follow the same steps as one and then strain the water in the can using a dense cloth. But this is often difficult with canned vegetables, which are especially soft. For this reason, it's recommended to only use fresh asparagus. What about white asparagus? Since the triangle parts are usually peeled already, rinsing well is sufficient. What about artichokes? Artichokes are infested by insects. to the point that there could be tens and even hundreds of bugs in each head. So what do you do with the leaves? Detach all the leaves completely before cooking, including the edges where they are attached to the heart. Soak in a solution of dish detergent for 3 minutes. Then take each leaf separately and rinse under strong running water while rubbing on both sides with one hand. According to the OU, one should examine each leaf individually, but soaking is not necessary. According to the Star K, it's too complicated to check artichoke leaves, and they should not be used. What about the bottoms? Remove all the leaves completely, such that the bottoms are smooth. The bottoms should then be rinsed in water, and artichoke bottoms that are sold separately are assumed to be insect-free. You should only rinse them. And what about broccoli? Broccoli is one of the most infested vegetables due to its green color, which attracts insects, as well as it has thousands of florets, which allow for insects to easily hide inside. I don't know if we're making people sick tonight because they're thinking about all these broccoli and artichokes they've eaten in the past.
Well, Ernie, it's interesting about artichokes. I mean, I eat artichokes, and I can tell you, well, there was one time where I did find artichoke that had bugs in it. All the other times I've ever eaten artichokes, I don't see any bugs in them.
I don't either.
Okay.
I don't know if it depends on the brand or where it's purchased, but it's interesting how that the level of stricture over here that they're applying here. Basically,
Right.
destroying the whole artichoke. Can't even cook it. How to cook the artichoke?
So they say like this about broccoli. They say, unfortunately, most methods of inspection are not effective for broccoli. Soaking it in salt water or vinegar solution is not effective, and many insects remain inside. Placing the broccoli on the fire briefly is also not effective, as although the insects may die, their skeleton remains whole, and therefore they're still subject to the rule of burial, which we learned is not bottle. So what do we do with broccoli? So fresh broccoli, it's recommended to use only the stems of fresh broccoli, which constitutes about 80% of the weight of the vegetable. To check them, remove all the florets so that only the stems remain. Then soak the stems in detergent for 3 minutes, rinse them thoroughly in strong running water. Some posts can permit rinsing the florets as well in the solution with dishwashing liquid and then grinding them up in a blender. According to the OU, when they parboil for 1 minute, separate each head and check the branch hair of each floret carefully in the manner described in the guide. If 3 or more insects are found, the head must be discarded. And then higher quality frozen broccoli sold by food companies is not 100% bug-free. Although the broccoli is sprayed well, this does not ensure that it's totally clean. In fact, the FDA permits up to 60 insects and 100 grams of frozen broccoli. Due to the freezing process, it's difficult to separate and remove all the insects from the broccoli. It is therefore not recommended by many poskim to use most frozen broccoli. The only types that are not subject to these issues are the insect-free broccoli produced by brands such as Bodake and Eden in the US, as well as some relatively recent brands of Gush Katif, insect-free broccoli. You can tell when this was written, a long time ago. The latter should be rinsed under running water prior to use, and ideally soaked in solution with dish detergent. According to the Star K and CRC, one may soak frozen broccoli in detergent solution and then check using the thrip cloth method and light box in the manner described. Now, what about lettuce? Lettuce has a high infestation rate. Iceberg lettuce. Clean the lettuce leaves by detaching each leaf from the stem and soaking them in a solution of dish detergent solution for 3 minutes. Then rinse each leaf separately in running water. Shake the water off or let it drop off. Then check both sides of each leaf using a special light box or desk lamp. Sunlight may also be used to check. According to the OU, one may remove the outer layers and check 4 of the leaves in direct light and rinse the rest, if packed tightly together, without checking in the manner described in their guide. But if 3 or more insects are found, everything must be checked. What about romaine lettuce? Clean the lettuce leaves by detaching each leaf from the stem, soaking them in solution of dish detergent for 3 minutes, then rub each leaf on both sides with a vegetable brush or the light dipped in the detergent solution. Rinse well in running water, making sure that the water reaches every corner on both sides of the leaf. Then again, you have to check each leaf with the special light box or desk lamp. As I told you, when I went to Costa Rica, the mashgiach did this on every lettuce leaf that we ate. Insect-free lettuce sold in Israel, known as Gush Katif lettuce, Again, it's recommended to soak these in a solution of this detergent for 3 minutes. Dried figs often contain insects. Depends on which country they are. One first inspects the inside of the container and the outside of the figs. If many small white crumbs are visible, they may be from mites, known as a caracero, and the figs should not be eaten because you can't remove them. If the outside of the figs is clean, one cuts them in half with a knife. The insides are then inspected using strong light. Any black areas inside the fig should be removed, as there's no effective method of checking it. One can remove some of the seeds to make the inspection easier. Finally, strawberries. Strawberries are also presumed to contain insects in most countries. Prior to checking them, one should cut off the stems, at least with 1 millimeter of the fruit. Some recommend cutting the strawberry in half. And then there are methods for cleaning it. Some suggest soaking them in a solution of dish detergent for 3 minutes. Rinse them in a gentle cyclical motion. One then rinses them off in a powerful spray of running water while turning them over from side to side. Another suggestion is to check a sample of 3 strawberries after soaking in a solution of dish detergent. If they are found clean, then all of the strawberries may be eaten. Another approach is to either cut off the outside of the strawberries or follow the instructions above and grind them up and blend them. So at least we've been exposed to the halachas of checking insects.
For all of our wives who do this, I would assume we have to presume that they are nashim tzidkanios if they're doing all of these things.
Ernie,
Yes.
I have a question, not towards food, but meat, cachuring meat. I know it's not the day that you spoke about it. What if you can buy meat that you know was shechted yesterday and you buy it to make a barbecue, like ribs? What, do you have to casher it? Because it goes
Of
on the
course.
fire. It goes on the fire.
It has to be koshered. Has to be
Even if it-
koshered. Has to be koshered, of course.
The
Has to
same
be
way
koshered.
with water and salt?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. All right.
We talked last time about roasting liver.
Yeah, I know that. That's what
Yeah.
came to my mind.
Yeah, but regular meat has to be koshered with salt first.
Even if it's within 3 days of being shechted.
It has to
and
be,
goes-
in fact, it has to be salted within 3 days. If it's beyond 3 days, it's halachically very problematic. And that's where that's the issue of frozen meat that comes from Argentina to Israel. That was a huge controversy regarding that because it would be salted only when they arrived in Israel. It's beyond 3 days of shechita, but it was frozen. So we won't go, but the
All right.
Mikra Adin, meat has to be salted within the first 3 days of shechita.
Okay. All right.
Okay, let's at least start the new subject. We're in volume 5. Does everybody have volume 5? Yes, hopefully. So we're on page 23. In this volume of the Tzurba M'Rabanan, we will continue studying the laws of kashrus and apply them to our lives in modern times. This first year focuses on the kashrus of electric appliances found in the home and how to use them without violating the rules of basar b'cholah. Modern technology has developed many wonderful inventions that can be used in the kitchen to facilitate food preparation, which were unavailable in previous generations. They include refrigerators, modern ovens and stoves, running water in sinks, microwaves, and dishwashers. However, many of these appliances raise new questions concerning how to use them in a halachically permissible manner. And poskim in the last century have confronted this for the first time. So we will study some of the halachic principles relevant for each one and see how the rulings given by modern poskim emerge from these principles. So let's talk about refrigerators. When milk spills on meat. We have already discussed some suggested guidelines for using refrigerators and freezers for meat and dairy and attempting to maintain a separation between them. What happens though when, despite our best efforts, some milk spills on a piece of chicken or meat in the refrigerator? One hand, the case is more lenient than other cases of basar b'cholah that were mixed together, since both the chicken and the milk in the fridge are not hot. Therefore, the refrigerator itself is still kosher. On the other hand, there may be some absorption of the milk within the chicken, and perhaps the chicken has become treif. We The Gemara in Tzachim discusses a similar case. Ahu bar Guzla, there was a bird, the Nafalakata de Kamcha, that fell into some like mayonnaise. It was like kutach that was made with milk. Shaya Rav Chinana Breda Rava Mipshrum. Rav Chinana permitted, even though this piece of chicken fell into this mayonnaise that has milk in it, he permitted you to eat that fowl because it was a bird. Hani milichai. The Gemara qualifies. That's if the meat was raw. Aval tzli, if the meat was roasted. Now, hang on a minute. We'll find out exactly what that means. That means, is it roasted and it's hot, and you had just put it in the refrigerator, but it's still hot? Or we're talking about it's roasted, but it's a cold piece of chicken that was roasted. The Gemara doesn't tell us, but the Gemara says, boy, klipa. Remember, klipas, you have to take off a piece the size of a fingernail. Means you have to remove the piece that the milk fell on, and then you can eat the rest of the piece. V'lo amarna l'lesbe pili. But that's if there are no cracks in the chicken. Aval isbe pili usher. If there are cracks, the whole piece becomes prohibited. V'imetuvli betavli. And if the chicken had been spiced, also usher. That's the Gemara. Now, based on this Gemara, we're going to go to town. Halacha. According to the Gemara, it seems that poultry that fell into a pot of milk would be permitted for consumption, assuming it's rinsed off from any milk residue. But this leniency is limited to where the poultry is raw and doesn't have cracks and is not flavored with spices. If it's roasted, or presumably cooked as well, then at least the gedei klipa is forbidden. The rest of it could be eaten, but you have to remove a klipa. The Rishonim that we're going to quote below all understand that the additional case of having cracks or being flavored with spices refer only to the case where the poultry is roasted. But where it is raw, it is always permitted. It means even if it has cracks or you spiced up a raw piece of meat is all, if milk falls in it, we've always learned, cold, there's no absorption, you just rinse it off and you can eat the piece of meat. And the Rishonim are also saying that even if it was spiced or there's cracks, they're still permitted. But there's some Rishonim, such as the Sefer Truma, cited in the Ran, which interpret those additional stringencies as applying to the case where it's raw as well. So we'll see whether we have to be choshesh to that Rishon, that even a raw piece of meat, if it had cracks or spiced and milk fell on it, there's at least one Rishon, Sefer Truma, that seems to prohibit at least the kedei klipa. Now, the Rishonim dispute, I'm back into the, not the footnote. However, the Rishonim dispute the parameters of what's meant by roasted and flavored with spice. According to the Ran and the Rashba, both of these refer only to a case where the meat of poultry is still hot. But if it's cooked or roasted but cold, it would be permitted after rinsing. This Isser of Kedei Klipa is not with a piece of cold meat, even though it was roasted or cooked. And it's only, let's say you had just cooked it or roasted it and just put it in the refrigerator, but it's still hot, and the piece of milk fell on it, then you'd have to remove a Kedei Klipa. Says the Ran in his commentary of Chulin, that Daminan Chai, that what we said, Rahain Utsone, I mean, it's cold. Utsli, that one the Gemara said, Tzli, Hainu Rosea, means it's hot. Aval Tzli Tsone, but if it was roasted, but now it's cold, Hareu Kashar Tsone in the Alma, the Sagile Badocha, that's like every case of meat that is cold, that all you got to do is rinse it off. El Tzli Rotech Ka'am. When the Gemara said that you have to take off the Kedei Klipa, that means it was roasted and it's still hot. The Talmud will refer to a hot piece of roasted meat as tzli, even though it didn't say tzli cham or tzli roseach. It's understood, says the Ran. Nami, that the iaspe pili, that which the Gemara said if it had cracks and a piece of milk fell on it, the whole piece was also not even a kedei klipa. Hainu b'tzli roseach. Again, if it's hot. This pili, it has cracks. Like a pili bola. What's with the cracks? Because the milk goes into the cracks, you can't get it out. Or v'mitva b'tavlet, or if it was spiced up, Bavi roteach. Afagav de lesbe pili kulo aser. But so it's clear that the Ran holds that this isser of either kulo by pili or tavlin or k'dei klipa, that if it just fell on it, is only if the piece of meat was still hot. Thus, according to the Ran, if the poultry is cooked and still hot, the outer layer is forbidden, k'dei klipa. And if there are cracks or if it's spicy, then greater absorption takes place, and the entire piece is forbidden. You got to throw it in. If the item is cold, according to the Ran, it's always permitted no matter what. On the other hand, Tosas and the Rosh interpret the Gemara to mean that the meat or poultry is forbidden if it's roasted, even if it's currently not hot, because the roasting made it softer. So even though it's cold, it's going to absorb more. Says the Rosh, because of our Rosh, about Sli, boy klipa, afilu tzone, even if it's cold. Through the roasting process, that piece of chicken got softer, bolea. And bolea only k'dei klipa. But the ispe pili also kule, below sagile klipa. And if it had cracks in it, then the whole piece would be also, you couldn't just take off the klipa. According to the Rosh, if it's raw, it's permitted no matter what. While if it's roasted, whether hot or cold, the outer peel must be removed. That's if it doesn't have cracks or spices. But if it has cracks or spices, the entire piece is forbidden. Okay, so now we had the Gemara, we had the Ran's understanding of the Gemara and the Rashba, and then we had Tosas and the Rosh's understanding. What did Shulchan Aruch say? He ruled in accordance with the Ran that cooked cold meat or poultry. You notice that they do not say specifically chicken or bird, even meat. Even though the Gemara's case, I want you to just keep that in mind. Even though the Gemara's case was a case of poultry, here they make no nafkamina. Cooked cold meat or poultry that absorbs milk is permitted to eat, even if it had been cooked, as long as it's cold. But the Ramah rules that one should be machmir in accordance with the Rosh, unless it's a hefsid meruba. So we Ashkenazim who follow the Ramah would be more machmir. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Sli roteach, shenofa lemaliach, a piece of roasted hot meat that fell into a dairy dish. Afilu necha machmas mocha. And that dairy dish could be eaten. It wasn't so salty that it made it unedible. So in that case, boy klipa. So it absorbs a klipa and has to be removed. Remember, it doesn't have pili, it's not tavlin. So he's going that if it's hot, you got to remove a klipa. And then if yeshbo b'koin, if it has cracks, right? If a hot piece of meat fell into a bowl of milk and it's got cracks and spices, the whole meat is usher. If it's hot, it's not cracked or spiced, you could just remove a klipa all the way around. You could eat the rest of the meat. But says the Ramav Yeshomim Gafilu Hein Sonani, right? The Shulchan Aruch didn't say anything about, only said if it was hot, implying that if it's cold, it's permitted. The Ramav says Yeshomim Gafilu Hein Sonani, Dina Hachi, that if it doesn't have cracks or spices, you have to take off a klipa. And Yeshlino Gemein Hefsid Meruba. Now, if you're prepared a meal for 1,000 people, you're going to lose 1,000. You're going to lose hefsed meruba. The Ramah says you can rely on the Shulchan Aruch that if it was cold, you didn't have to do klip at all. It's like the Ran, you just wash it off. According to this, it would seem that the lacha for Sfardim should be that cold chicken that had milk spilled on it should be permitted after rinsing it, while for Ashkenazim, based on the Ramah, it should be forbidden, at least the klipa. However, Tzvi Pesach Frank, who died in 1960, was the Rav of Yerushalayim. He wrote the Mikrei Kodesh. He was sort of a proto-Zionist, I would say. He was involved in appointing a Rav Kook, the chief rabbi. But virtually all of the Gaonim in Eretz Yisrael looked to Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank as a halachic posek. That and he writes in the Har Tzvi that even Ashkenazim may be lenient provided it's eaten cold. And let's learn this last tshuva. Nishalti, he was asked, Bikder shel chalav, she'antu b'madav ha'elyon shel mekarer. There was a pot of milk on the upper shelf of the refrigerator. U'mitachteh hayta munachat chatichat of kar mevushal. And there was a piece of cooked chicken underneath it. It was cold. By Yedei Tezuzah, they moved the milk. Nishpach chalav l'toch hakli shebasar af munach. And the milk fell into the kli that the chicken was in. V'nireh shebedidon shel faneinu yesh litzadid leheter. Sharei basar of b'chalav eino ela midrabanan. Listen, the whole eating chicken and milk, even if you cooked it together with heat, is mutter midoraisa. It's only asa midrabanan. U'rayt u'beprat shebelo bishul gam basar b'heino ela midrabanan. That means if you ate a piece of cheese with a piece of meat together cold, so that's only Asr Midrabanan. You have not eaten Basar B'cholav Midoraisa. Basar B'cholav Midoraisa is you have to cook it. So number one, there's a lot to cook it, and there's a lot to eat it. To eat it, Midoraisa, if the Basar B'cholav is mixed with heat. But if you ate a sandwich, a bologna sandwich with a cheese sandwich, that's an Isra Midrabanan. If it's cold, it's an Isra Midrabanan. Ivra, on the other side, Shaposkim Machmirin, right? The Beis Yos, the Rosh, he said that when you have to be Machmir, you make no difference between meat and chicken. Machmirin Gam Ba'oth. Shari Komach Lokat Aposkim Ben Yizet Tlu Beferish Divrei Gemara, Dahu Bar Gozla, but the case of the Gemara was a piece of bird. To Nafal Akutcha Shubasar Avi Kol Makam Ladina, Sha'anu Machmir Mishum Sveika Dedina, Yesh. So in our case, where there's a yesh lahakel b'basar of shumid rabbanon, the lismoch ala poskim amatirim, ubeprat sheyesh gan trade rabbanon. The gam basar be'ema below bishul enamot. We have two rabbanons here. The whole issue of chicken and milk is only rabbanon, and you're eating it cold is also rabbanon. So you have two rabbanons. Look in the Taz, shesham mavur shegam harishal eno machmer ela b'nimlach k'tzat. So that if the dairy dish was salted, then that's why he had a problem. So Rav Tzvi Pesach Rank gave a psak just to rinse off the chicken. The lechol at the odokar, eat it while it's still cold. Don't heat it up, because he's concerned maybe there's some milk fragments going to remain there, and then you'll have basar b'cholov. Midrabanan. Ki abishul atzmo he isur v'yesh tzat sofik shem nishar tam chalav v'pili v'nosin sofik l'chatchila. There's a nice biography of Rav Pesach Frank. According to Rav Frank, Ashkenazim may also be lenient specifically where the milk fell onto a piece of chicken, since chicken and milk only violates basar b'cholav drabanan. Plus, the chicken and milk were not cooked together, which creates a double drabanan. Consequently, there's room to rely on the more lenient opinions that are lenient when the cooked chicken is cold, provided it's also eaten cold. Despite the fact that the Gemara's case also referred to poultry, right? But it could be that there is no room to be lenient if a piece of meat had been cooked, because then you'll have one drabanan. You don't have the two drabanans. So if Pesach Frank was matir because of the trade rabbanan, there would be an afkamina, a cold piece of chicken versus a cold piece of meat. That would be an afkamina in the store of Rav Frank. Okay, any comments, questions, or arrows? I think we covered a lot of ground tonight.
Yeah.
Shkoyach, Reni.